Hi, friend. Welcome to Rainy Tales, a quiet place for gentle stories told beneath the sound of rain. Now, let's begin tonight's story. The rain had begun hours ago, and it showed no sign of stopping. Outside my window, droplets traced slow paths down the glass, merging, parting, whispering their small songs against the world. Inside, a single lamp glowed beside a half-full cup of jasmine tea. The air was warm with its scent, something faintly sweet, something like memory. I leaned back in the wooden chair, listening. Sometimes, when the world feels too distant to touch, the sound of rain feels like company. The room was small, just enough for a desk, a stack of books, and the quiet hum of solitude. I liked it that way. There was comfort in knowing where everything was, in the soft order of things. A folded blanket on the armchair, a candle half burned out, the faint outline of raindrops trembling in the light. It was, in its own way, enough. Yet tonight, as the rain fell heavier, I felt a strange ache at the edge of that stillness. The kind of ache that comes when something remembered begins to stir God. It started with a sound, the low murmur of thunder in the distance, echoing through the wet air. The rhythm of it pulled a memory from the quiet. A bridge, somewhere in the city, where two people once stood beneath the same rain. I had not thought of that night in years. But memories, like rain, find their own way back. You can close the window, yet somehow the sound still reaches you. I remember the bridge is narrow and old, its stones polished smooth by years of footsteps. A street lamp stood at one end, its light bending through the drizzle into soft amber circles on the ground. The river below moved lazily, carrying reflections of the world above a patchwork of lights, shadows, and secrets that never quite reached the surface. And I remember you. The way you stood there with an umbrella too small for both of us, insisting we could fit beneath it anyway. You laughed when raindrops slid down my hair, brushing them away with fingers that trembled as if they'd never forgotten warmth before. I remember thinking how strange it was that two strangers could feel like home so quickly. That was long ago. The seasons turned, the bridge changed colors, and our names became distant things letters that once fit together, but now drift apart. Yet on nights like this, when the rain returns and the tea cools slowly beside the lamp, I can still hear it, the rhythm of your voice beneath the rain, the pause before a word that never came. I wonder sometimes if that's why rain feels so familiar. It hides what cannot be said, softens what hurts to remember. It carries the world in its quiet persistence, touching everything, asking nothing. Maybe that's what love was like for us. Gentle, inevitable, and gone before we understood. The clock on the wall ticks softly. Outside, the street glimmers under a thin veil of mist. I draw the curtains slightly, leaving just enough space to see the rain shimmer in the lamp's reflection. There's a comfort in its repetition, the steady reminder that everything, even sorrow, can sound like peace if you listen long enough. In this stillness, I realize I'm not waiting for the rain to stop. I'm waiting for it to speak, to tell me why, after all this time, the bridge in my memory still feels wet beneath my feet. Perhaps tonight it will. Perhaps in this rain, I will finally hear what our silence was trying to say. I take another sip of tea, now lukewarm but soothing. My reflection on the window looks older, softer, maybe even kinder than I remember. Time does that. It takes sharpness and turns it into something round, like pebbles in a river. I close my eyes, let the sound of rain fill the room, and for the first time in months, I let the memory unfold without fear. Outside, thunder hums again, distant but gentle, like an echo of a goodbye spoken years ago. Inside, the rain becomes a lullaby for the things we never said, for the bridge where two souls once paused between holding on and letting go. And as I sit there, listening, I realize some stories don't end. They just quiet down, waiting for the rain to return. The bridge appears first as a blur, a shape the mind remembers before it sees. In my memory, the rain never really stopped that night. It only softened, falling in silver threads that trembled against the streetlights. The old iron rails gleamed like wet ink, and every droplet that landed on the river below became a brief star before fading into the current. It wasn't just a place where we met. It was the pause between two lives, the hinge between what was and what would never be again. I used to cross that bridge often, even before I met you. It connected one quiet part of the city to another. Nothing remarkable about it, until it became the setting for everything I didn't know how to lose. Funny how memory transforms ordinary places into sanctuaries. After that night, I couldn't cross it without feeling the weight of what lingered there. Our voices, our laughter, the hush that settled when we didn't know what to say next. You had said you liked bridges. They're neither here nor there, you told me, watching raindrops ripple the river below. They belong to both sides and neither. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Some people, some moments, are like that temporary crossings between what we want and what we can't have. That night, I remember how your coat clung to your shoulders, the dark fabric glistening under the lamplight. You had forgotten your gloves again. I offered mine, but you smiled and shook your head, saying the cold kept you awake. You always said small things like that, sentences that seemed ordinary, but carried something deeper. A way of living you never put into words. I think of how we walked side by side, the umbrella tilted awkwardly between us. Sometimes our arms brushed. Sometimes we stepped into the same puddle. The world around us disappeared into the rhythm of rain and footsteps. And it felt as though time had quietly folded itself, so that only that bridge existed. You told me about the sound of rain where you grew up, how it used to drum on the tin roof until morning, how you'd stay awake counting each drop until you fell asleep without realizing. I remember listening, imagining it. You had a way of speaking it painted the air with calm, as though even the heaviest storm was just another way of finding silence. And then, without meaning to, I began to remember my own childhood, the smell of wet soil after the first rain, the sight of my mother closing the windows while humming something soft and wordless. Memory has a strange way of pairing things. Sometimes one person's story unlocks 100 of your own. Maybe that's what made us close. Your words were keys to places in me I hadn't opened in years. That night, the rain wasn't cruel. It was gentle, like a companion that knew it had to stay between us. It filled the pauses, erased the awkward edges of goodbye. We both knew something was shifting, though neither of us dared to name it. The way your gaze lingered on the river, the way my hand stayed still when it wanted to reach out, all of it was a language we didn't need to speak. I remember the smell of the rain, metallic, soft, alive. The way the river swelled slightly, carrying reflections of our faces in fragments, like pieces of a story the water couldn't quite hold together. And above it all, the bridge arched, patient and eternal, as if it had seen this kind of parting before. Sometimes I wonder if that bridge remembers us, if it holds a trace of those who once stood beneath its lamps, whispering truths too fragile for daylight. Perhaps when the rain falls, the stones recall the weight of our steps, the sound of our breaths mingling with the storm. Perhaps every drop that lands on its surface is another echo of what we left behind. The rain outside my window thickens, blurring the present into the past again. My reflection fades behind the glass, and all I see is that bridge, wet, gleaming, infinite. Somewhere in that memory, we are still standing there, not yet ready to leave, still pretending the rain could hide the inevitable. And maybe that's what love is. At its quietest, two souls caught on a bridge, waiting for the rain to decide who should let go first. It was under that same bridge light that we first met. The night was soaked through, and the city seemed to hum with the sound of rain hitting metal, glass, and forgotten leaves. I remember standing there, half sheltered beneath an old umbrella that had begun to give up on its hinges. When you appeared from the other side, your coat darkened by water, your hair plastered to your forehead, and yet you smiled as if the storm had chosen you for company. You asked if you could share the umbrella. The request was so simple, so human, that I forgot to answer at first. You laughed then, a sound as soft as the rain itself, and stepped closer without waiting for permission. The umbrella was small, too small for two, but somehow we fit. The air between us warmed, scented faintly with rain and something floral from your scarf. I remember thinking that no one had ever stood so close to me and felt so calm. We walked together without plan, our footsteps falling into rhythm. The rain softened everything it touched. The streets glistened like glass. Streetlights blurred into golden halos, and the world felt dreamlike, suspended between waking and memory. You spoke about the things you loved, books left open on rainy afternoons, the smell of paper after tea spills, the way thunder sounded like a heartbeat when you were a child. I told you about my habit of keeping a journal filled with sentences that never found endings. You said you understood that some words were meant only for the rain to hear. That was the first thing you ever said that stayed with me. Even now, when the rain begins, I can almost hear you whispering it again, as if the wind has carried your voice across the year's dot at one point. The umbrella tilted too far, and a thin stream of rain slid down my neck. You reached up quickly to adjust it, your fingers brushing against my hair. For a moment, everything stopped, the sound, the movement, the city itself. And in that stillness, I saw something in your eyes I couldn't name. Not love, not yet, but a quiet recognition, as though we were both remembering something we hadn't lived yet. We found a small cafe at the end of the bridge, glowing softly through fogged windows. Inside, the world smelled of roasted beans and wet wool. You ordered tea, I ordered coffee, and we sat by the glass, watching the river run with liquid light. You said you liked that feeling, being somewhere warm while the world outside was cold and unreachable. I nodded, though what I really liked was watching the rain reflected in your eyes. We talked until our cups went cold. The conversation drifted from books to childhood fears, from music to the way rain changes color under different lamps. It was the kind of talk that didn't need to lead anywhere. It simply existed, like the rain, soft, endless, necessary. When you laughed, it felt like the first warmth of spring breaking through gray clouds. When it was time to leave, you stood first. Keep the umbrella, you said. It suits you more. I tried to protest, but you only smiled again, that same quiet, knowing smile, and walked back into the rain. I watched you until the mist swallowed your silhouette, until all that was left was the sound of the river and the memory of someone who had made an ordinary night feel like a beginning. That umbrella stayed with me for years. The fabric faded from black to gray, the handle cracked, but I could never throw it away. Sometimes, when I opened it, the faint scent of that night returned: rain, tea, and something human I could never name. Maybe that's why memories cling to small things. A cup, a letter, an umbrella. They're too fragile to hold feelings, yet somehow they do. And long after people leave, those objects keep their warmth for us, quietly. Like the rain keeps the shape of every drop that has ever fallen. Even now, as I sit by my window and listen to the storm, I can almost see that moment again. Two strangers beneath a too small umbrella, the world dissolving in silver light, and somewhere deep in the heart, the faint, trembling awareness that one day, that same bridge would be where we say goodbye. The letter has been sitting on my desk for days now. Its paper has curled slightly at the edges, touched too often by indecision. The ink on the first few lines has already faded into the kind of blue that feels like distance. I began writing it one evening when the rain first returned for the season. I thought I could finally put into words what time had softened but never erased. Yet even now, the letter remains unfinished, caught between confession and silence, between wanting you to know and wanting you to rest in peace. Within memory. It begins simply, "Dear you, I never knew how to write your name. Somehow it felt too small for what you had been to me. Names belong to the living, to the present tense. You had become something else, an echo that moved through quiet hours, a presence that never needed to be summoned. Every time I pick up the pen, the words come and go like clouds. I write one sentence, then erase it, then begin again. Perhaps that's how memory works. It writes and rewrites the same moment until meaning wears thin, leaving only feeling behind. I wanted to tell you that I still keep the umbrella. That sometimes, on slow mornings, I take it out from the drawer, open it indoors, just to hear the faint sound of fabric unfolding, like a sigh. I wanted to tell you that the bridge is still there, unchanged, though the lanterns have been replaced with brighter ones, and the river smells less of rain and more of city. The world moves on, but certain places stay loyal to the past. I wanted to tell you that I still make jasmine tea on cold nights, even though I never quite get the taste right. The scent reminds me of that cafe near the bridge, where your laugh mingled with the sound of cups and distant thunder. I wanted to tell you that I've learned to live without expecting answers. That silence can be its own kind of reply. But mostly, I wanted to tell you this. I forgive you. Not for anything you did, but for leaving in the quiet way that rain leaves a window slowly, invisibly and without malice. I forgive myself too, for not knowing how to hold on, for mistaking fear for peace, and for standing on that bridge, thinking goodbye was something words could contain. Sometimes I think if I finish this letter, it will be the end of the story. But part of me isn't ready for endings. Maybe that's why I leave it open, like a door that leads nowhere, but still lets the air move through. Some things are meant to stay unfinished, not because they're broken, but because they were never meant to be whole. I remember one evening long ago, you said, "The rain always sounds the same, but it never falls on the same world twice." I didn't understand then, but I do now. Each time the rain returns, it touches new leaves, new rooftops, new hearts trying to remember or forget. The rain is faithful not to what was, but to what keeps living. Maybe that's what healing looks like, the ability to let the same sound mean something gentler each time it finds you. I put the pen down and watch the candle burn lower, the flame bowing toward the open letter like it, too, wants to read what I haven't written. Outside, the night hums with steady rain, and the sound is softer than I remember. It fills the gaps between sentences, makes silence feel like language again. I wonder where you are now, or if where even matters anymore. Maybe somewhere, the same rain falls on another window, and someone else pauses mid-sentence, thinking of a bridge, an umbrella, a pair of eyes that once made the world smaller and kinder. Maybe that's how we exist after love, ends not in photographs or promises, but in the quiet repetition of being remembered by the weather. I leave the letter open. The ink will blur if the wind carries even one drop through the window, but that feels right. Some words deserve to fade, to become part of the air. I close my eyes, listen, and for a moment, it feels as if you are here, not as a ghost, but as calm. The kind that comes after years of rain, when everything finally stops trying to be something else. The rain had slowed to a mist when I finally decided to go back. I don't know what drew me there, nostalgia, unfinished thoughts, or the quiet pull of places that once held us. The bridge had waded through all the seasons, under summer heat, under falling leaves, under snow that erased every footprint. I hadn't seen it in years, yet when I reached it, it felt as though it had been expecting me. The stones were darker now, polished by time and weather. Moss had grown along the railing, and the river below moved with the calm patience of something that had watched countless goodbyes. I stopped halfway across, where we had once stood beneath the same flickering lamp. The city around me had changed new buildings, brighter signs, but the sound of the river was the same, and for a moment, I could almost believe that nothing had moved at all. I took a deep breath, the kind that feels heavier than it should, and felt the air settle inside my chest like memory. My reflection shimmered faintly in a puddle near my feet holder, quieter, yet carrying all the same questions I'd had that night. I thought about what it meant to come back, not to start over, not to mourn, but to see what remains when everything else has faded. Sometimes we return to places not to find what was lost, but to understand what stayed. Standing there, I realized how much of you had become part of the landscape itself. The sound of rain on metal, the faint scent of tea that drifted from a cafe nearby, the way the air grew still before thunder. You weren't gone. You had simply dissolved into everything I'd learned to love since. I leaned against the railing and watched the river carry small leaves downstream. Each one spun briefly before disappearing under the arch. There was something peaceful about their surrender, about how they didn't fight the current. I wondered if we had ever really let go, or if some part of us was still floating somewhere beneath the surface, carried by something larger than will. A group of strangers crossed the bridge, laughing beneath umbrellas. For a moment, I envied their simplicity, their ease with the present, their laughter unshadowed by memory. But as they passed, one of them turned, smiled politely, and said, "Beautiful night, isn't it?" I nodded. It was. Beautiful, because it didn't belong to anyone anymore. Beautiful, because it had learned how to hold both joy and sorrow in the same breath. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the folded piece of paper, the letter I still hadn't sealed. I took it out, the words faint under dim light, and read them again. They didn't ache as much this time. They felt like footprints, proof of a journey, not a wound. I smiled, a small, almost invisible thing, and whispered to the river, "You can have this." I tore the letter in half, then into smaller pieces, letting them slip through my fingers. The paper drifted for a moment before landing softly on the water, spreading apart, dissolving. It wasn't an act of forgetting. It was a way of giving the story back to the world that made it. The mist grew heavier, wrapping the bridge in quiet light. I could hear my heartbeat in the stillness, slow and steady, echoing like a promise kept. I thought of you, how you always said rain was just the sky's way of remembering the ocean. Maybe this was the same, a small returning, a way of remembering without holding on. When I finally turned to leave, the street lights flickered once, casting the whole bridge in amber for a heartbeat. The puddles shimmered like glass, and for just a second, I saw two reflections instead of one. Mine and the shadow of someone standing beside me, smiling softly. Umbrella tilted to share the space. I blinked, and the image was gone. But the warmth it left was real dot as I walked home. The mist followed me gently, settling on my shoulders like a blessing. The rain no longer sounded like sorrow. It sounded like breath. Like a quiet song the world hums when it wants you to know you've made peace with the past. And in that moment, I did. There was something sacred about the quiet that followed. I stood at the edge of the bridge a long while after the letter was gone, my hand resting lightly on the damp railing. The world had settled into stillness, as if listening. The rain, the river, even the faint hum of the city beyond all, seemed to wait for something neither of us could say. That was what it had always been about, wasn't it? The unsaid things, the moments that hovered between us, trembling like raindrops that never fell. Words too tender to release, fears too fragile to name. On that bridge, years ago, we spoke around them, circling truths that our hearts understood, but our mouths could never shape. You had looked at me that night with eyes full of softness and apology, and I remember thinking that love could sometimes sound like silence. You reached out as if to touch my hand, then stopped halfway. I wanted to reach back, but something held me still. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the quiet knowledge that if we touched, neither of us would know how to let go. The rain filled the pause for us, 1,000 tiny voices saying what we could not. It drummed softly on the umbrella, on the railing, on our shoulders. Each drop seemed to whisper, not yet, not now, but someday. And maybe that's why I remember it so vividly. The moment before something ends always lasts the longest. Looking back, I realized that everything meaningful between us lived in those pauses, in the space where our words stopped and our breathing began. You once said that silence was your favorite sound because it made room for truth. I didn't understand it then. I do now. Truth doesn't always need to be spoken. Sometimes it just needs to be felt and carried quietly. Like the weight of rain on a coat you don't bother to shake off. Standing there tonight, years later, I whispered into the mist. We never really said goodbye, did we? The air didn't answer, but a drop of rain slid down my cheek. Warm at first, then cool. Maybe that was reply enough. There are so many things we never said. I never told you how your voice steadied me when the world felt uncertain. You never told me how often you thought of leaving before you actually did. I never said I understood, that I would have let you go gently if you'd only asked. You never said that you were sorry, but perhaps you didn't have to. The way you looked at me under that flickering lamp, that was apology enough. The years have softened the edges of those memories. What once cut now simply lingers, like fog over water. I've stopped asking why. Love, I've learned, isn't a question that needs an answer. It's a bridge between two hearts that may never cross paths again, but still send echoes across the distance. I brushed my fingers across the cold iron railing, tracing the small grooves time had carved there. My hand came away wet, shining faintly in the lamplight. I thought of your hand that night, how it trembled slightly when you tucked a loose strand of hair behind your ear. How your ring caught the light as if it wanted to remember the moment. Too, there was a time I wished we had said everything, every truth, every confession, every apology. But now, I think our silence was its own kind of mercy. Words might have broken what tenderness we had left. The quiet kept it intact. Maybe that's why I returned. Understand that not everything unfinished is a wound. Some stories are meant to stay half-told, so their echo can last longer than their sound. The rain thickened again, a curtain of silver between me and the far shore. I stayed until the mist blurred the lanterns into soft halos. Then, before turning away, I whispered one last thing to the river. Thank you for what we could not say. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hear an answer. The silence was enough. It was strange, the way memory could wrap itself around sound. Even now, years later, when the rain began, I could still hear your voice hidden within it, soft, deliberate, warm, in the way certain evenings once were. I closed my eyes, and the years folded like pages, taking me back to that night when we made promises so small they almost didn't feel like promises at all. We had been sitting beneath the bridge's stone arch, waiting for the downpour to pass. The air smelled of river water and old earth. You held the umbrella between your knees, tracing circles on the wet ground with the tip of your shoe. We didn't talk much, but when you did speak, your words came out quiet and certain. Let's promise something simple, you said. Not forever, just kindness, no matter what happens. I remember the way you said it, like you were making peace with something you already knew was slipping away. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and we both smiled without looking at each other. It was a fragile kind of vow, not the kind lovers make to last a lifetime, but the kind souls make when they already sense an ending approaching. Kindness, that was the word we chose to leave between us. Not love, not forgiveness, just kindness. Something gentle enough to survive distance, to endure silence. And somehow, through the years, it did. There were times after you left when I wanted to be angry, when I thought anger might keep you closer than sorrow could. But each time, the memory of that night came back, the rain softening your face, your voice asking for gentleness, and the anger faded before it could even take shape. Maybe that's what kindness does. It keeps the heart from hardening, even when it breaks. I sometimes imagine that if we had stayed together, we would have grown tired of each other's silences, of the quiet ways we hid pain behind politeness. Perhaps we were meant to meet not to stay, but to remind one another that tenderness exists, that it's possible to touch a life softly and still change it forever. The rain deepened around me as I stood once again on that bridge, the same one that had witnessed so many promises and partings. Drops glimmered on the railing like small lanterns. I thought about how many vows had been made here by strangers, how many of them still lingered in the mist. Maybe bridges are sacred for that reason. They hold what people can't carry themselves. You had once said that rain was the only witness that never betrayed secrets. It listens and washes everything clean. Perhaps that's why I felt at peace here now, surrounded by it. The rain remembered our kindness for us, Dot. I took a step closer to the center of the bridge, feeling the boards shift faintly beneath my feet. The city lights shimmered on the river below, and somewhere far off, a church bell marked the passing of another hour. The sound felt like breathing, steady, alive, ordinary. I whispered into the night. I kept my promise. It wasn't for you, not exactly. It was for me. A way of saying I had learned to live gently, even when the world wasn't kind back. Maybe you did too, wherever you were. Maybe kindness had followed you the same way rain followed me, never demanding, only reminding. A breeze drifted through, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a nearby window. It mingled with the smell of rain, and for a brief second, the air felt just like that cafe again, warm, small, full of quiet laughter. I let the feeling stay without reaching for it, Dot. As I turned to leave, I looked over my shoulder one last time. The bridge glowed faintly beneath the rain, its reflection stretching across the river like a soft thread connecting two unseen shores. That was what our promise had become. Not an anchor, not a chain, but a thread. Something weightless, enduring, invisible. Kindness had kept us whole in the only way it could, by teaching us how to let go gently. There's a moment I still return to, even now, the night we chose kindness over blame. It wasn't planned, not the way you imagine such things. It just happened quietly, the way rain begins before you realize it's raining. We were standing on the bridge again, the same place, the same mist curling around the lanterns. The river below shimmered like liquid glass, catching pieces of light from the city. The storm had passed, but the air still held that restless hush that lingers afterward. You looked tired, not in your body, but somewhere deeper, behind the eyes. And for the first time, I understood that you were already halfway gone. I wanted to ask you to stay. The words formed and broke apart before they reached my lips. Maybe I knew that asking would only make leaving harder for both of us. So instead, I asked if you were cold. You laughed, that same small laugh that had once pulled me through entire winters. Always, you said, and reached up to brush rain from your eyelashes. There was no argument, no sudden burst of confession. Just silence, heavy and full, carrying everything we didn't say. Then, in a voice softer than the rain, you whispered, "We could hate each other someday, you know. But let's not. Let's remember this instead." This? I asked. You gestured toward the river, the sky, the lamplight pooling on wet stones. This stillness. This mercy. Mercy. It was such a gentle word, but it struck something deep. We had spent so long trying to make sense of love, to define it, to hold it still, that we'd forgotten mercy was also a kind of love. The kind that doesn't demand, doesn't bind, doesn't break. Just releases Dot, so we stood there, side by side, two silhouettes beneath a sighing sky, choosing not to wound each other even when we could. And that choice, that quiet human decision, became the softest miracle of my life. You turned toward me then, your face half lit by the lantern. There were tears in your eyes, but they shimmered like stars, not sorrow. You said, if we were different people, maybe this could have lasted. Maybe, I said, but then we wouldn't be us. You smiled, small and sad. The kind of smile that understands what goodbye really means. The rain began again, not heavy, just a fine drizzle that wrapped the world in silver. You looked up, closed your eyes, and let it touch your face. I watched you, memorizing everything, the way your breath fogged in the cold, the tremor of your hands, the sound of your voice when you said softly, "Thank you for not making this harder." And that was when I knew love doesn't end in absence or betrayal. It ends in mercy, in the decision to walk away gently, to leave something tender behind instead of ruin. We walked together to the edge of the bridge. The streets were quiet, the lamps humming faintly. I thought you would say something else, something final, but instead you slipped your hand into mine. Just once, just long enough to remind me that warmth could exist without a promise attached to it. Then you let go. I watched you walk away until the rain swallowed you, your shape dissolving into mist and lamplight. There was no drama, no echo of footsteps, just stillness, the pure, aching kind that holds both gratitude and grief at once. I stayed there a long time after you disappeared. The bridge seemed to breathe around me, each raindrop falling like punctuation to a sentence I couldn't finish. And when I finally turned to leave, I realized I was smiling, faintly but truly, because somehow we had turned an ending into something beautiful. Kindness had been our final language, and mercy our last embrace. And long after the rain stopped, that was what stayed. A peace we had given each other without even knowing how much it would mean. The lantern on the bridge burned low that night, its light trembling in the damp wind like a heart trying to stay steady. We stood beneath it, our shadows stretching long and soft across the wet stones. Around us, the city had gone quiet. No cars, no voices, just the river whispering beneath and the rain falling with unhurried grace. It felt as though the whole world had paused, holding its breath for our last moment together. You were the first to speak. I thought goodbyes would be louder, you said, your voice barely above the ring. I smiled faintly. Maybe the quiet ones last longer. You looked at me then, really looked. The kind of gaze that sees everything you were and everything you'll never be again. There was no anger, no regret, only tenderness. You took a slow step closer, the distance between us smaller than a sigh. For a heartbeat, I thought you might reach out, and maybe I would have let you. But instead, you slipped the umbrella into my hands. "You'll need it," you whispered. "You always walk home too slowly." I wanted to laugh, but the sound caught somewhere behind my ribs. The umbrella felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the weight of all our shared hours. The tea, the silence, the way we never quite said what we meant. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and you smiled one last time. "Take care," you said simply. Not goodbye, just that dot, and somehow that made it worse. Because take care meant you still wanted me to have warmth, to find safety, to keep walking, but it also meant you wouldn't be there to see it. A gust of wind swept across the bridge, scattering droplets of rain through the light. The world shimmered, half real, half memory. I wanted to tell you everything, that I forgave you, that I would remember you kindly, that I would never walk across this bridge without hearing your footsteps beside mine. But the words stayed behind my teeth, gentle prisoners of the heart. Instead, I lifted the umbrella over you one last time. The gesture felt too small, but it was all I had. You hesitated, then stepped beneath it for a few breaths. We stood like that, two souls beneath borrowed shelter, the rain whispering all around us. It felt like the world had shrunk to that small circle of dry air, like the river, the city, even time itself had drawn back to give us space. When you finally stepped away, I didn't follow. The umbrella tilted, rain running down one side, soaking my sleeve. You turned back only once, your face blurred by mist, and I thought I saw you smile. A soft, grateful smile, the kind that carries both love and release. Then you walked into the rain, your footsteps barely leaving a sound. I watched until the light swallowed you whole, and then I stood there, under the trembling lantern, with the umbrella half open, half useless. The river below moved with quiet persistence, carrying reflections of the bridge, the lamp, and perhaps something of us too, something already fading, already gone. I lowered the umbrella, let the rain fall freely on my face. It was cold, sharp, cleansing. It felt like the first honest touch after too many soft lies. People talk about heartbreak as a shattering, but that night, it didn't feel like breaking. It felt like dissolving, as if the parts of me that had clung to us were gently washed away, leaving behind only what could still feel. When I finally turned to leave, the lantern flickered once more, brighter than before, then dimmed again. And in that brief flicker, I thought I heard something. Not a voice, not a word, but the faintest echo of breath, like someone exhaling peace. I whispered into the rain, "Good night," though you were far beyond hearing Dot. And in the hush that followed, I swear the bridge breathed with me, a slow, steady rhythm that felt like the world saying, "It's all right now." The umbrella swung loosely in my hand as I walked away. Behind me, the bridge stood quiet, patient, eternal keeper of 1,000 goodbyes, including ours, Dot. When tears came that night, they were indistinguishable from the rain. The sky wept with me, as if it too understood the tenderness of letting go. I remember standing halfway down the street, the umbrella hanging limp at my side, and feeling the rain blur everything, the lamplight, the river, even the ache in my chest, until sorrow itself became something soft. There's mercy in the rain, I think. It hides the traces of grief, turning what might have been a cry into something the world mistakes for weather. Every drop on my face could have been sadness or simply sky. It didn't matter. The rain was kind enough not to tell. I walked slowly, my shoes brushing against shallow puddles that mirrored the lanterns behind me. The bridge was growing smaller in the distance, yet it remained heavy in my heart, as though each step forward required me to carry it a little further before it could rest. Every memory echoed faintly in the rhythm of the storm, your voice, your laughter, the hush before you spoke. Even silence had a sound tonight. I stopped once beneath a streetlight, where the glow cut through the mist. The air shimmered gold and silver, tiny worlds spinning in every drop. I tilted my face upward, letting the rain trace its way down my cheeks, my neck, my hands. It wasn't sorrow anymore, it was release. Each drop seemed to whisper it's over, and you survived. There had been so many nights before, when I thought I couldn't survive it, when the weight of what we never said pressed too hard against the ribs. I'd tried to write it away, talk it away, sleep it away. But pain, I learned, isn't meant to be erased. It's meant to be softened, like stone in a river, until it becomes part of the landscape. That's what time had done. It didn't take you from me. It simply taught me how to hold you without breaking. You became a part of the world's quiet, the smell of wet pavement, the taste of rain on my lips, the faint hum of thunder somewhere behind the clouds. I thought of the first time you told me about your favorite sound, rain on rooftops. You said it made you feel less alone, that it reminded you everything was connected by the same sky. Back then, I didn't understand. But now, standing there beneath that same sky, drenched and shivering, I did. The rain was our witness, our confessor, our lullaby. A car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping through mist like two gentle ghosts. I stepped aside, watching the ripples it left behind in the puddles. Circles widening, fading, disappearing. That was love too, wasn't it? The way it ripples through time, never truly gone, just quieter. When I reached home, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I left the umbrella by the door, still dripping, and stood for a moment in the dark, listening to the rain against the windows. It sounded softer here, closer. I could almost imagine you on the other side of the city, hearing the same rhythm. Two lives moving apart, yet connected by the same sound. I walked to the mirror and caught my reflection in the faint glow from outside. My face looked calmer than I expected, tired, yes, but peaceful. The kind of peace that doesn't come from forgetting, but from understanding that some things aren't meant to stay. As I wiped my face dry, I noticed something. I couldn't tell anymore which drops were rain and which were tears. And maybe that was the point. When sorrow becomes so gentle, it's indistinguishable from the rain. You know you've healed? I went to the window, placed my hand on the cold glass, and whispered the words that had waited years to be spoken. Not to you, but to the night itself. Thank you for loving me the way the rain does, briefly, beautifully, and enough. Outside, the rain answered in its quiet language, falling a little slower now, like it too was tired. And somewhere between those falling drops, I felt something loosen in me. Not loss, not longing, just peace. Letting go never came all at once. It arrived like dawn, slowly, gently, so that I didn't realize it was happening until the light had already filled the room. There was no single moment when I decided to move on. It was a quiet unfolding, one breath at a time, like the way rain fades into drizzle and then into air. For months after that night, I found myself walking toward the bridge without meaning to. Sometimes after work, sometimes when the world felt too loud. It wasn't longing that drew me back. It was familiarity. The bridge had become a mirror for my own heart. Still standing, weathered, yet open to every passing storm. I'd stop halfway across, rest my hand on the railing, and feel the hum of the city beneath. It reminded me that life, like water, never stops moving forward. You had once told me that memories don't ask for permission. They simply arrive, like the rain. I used to fight that truth, wishing I could control when and how you appeared in my mind. But over time, I learned that remembering wasn't the same as holding on. It was a kind of honoring. To recall your voice, your laughter, even your silence, wasn't to keep you. It was to thank you for being part of my becoming. One afternoon, much later, I saw someone standing on the bridge where we once were. They held a small bouquet of white flowers, their face tilted to the rain. For a heartbeat, something inside me stirred, a reflex of memory, but it wasn't you, of course. Still, the sight of them made me smile. Life, I realized, keeps writing the same stories with different names, different endings. We are all part of the same rain. I thought about what it means to let go without erasing. Maybe it's not about forgetting, but about making space, room for new sounds, new scents, new beginnings to enter. Letting go, I discovered, isn't an act of loss. It's an act of faith. Faith that love, once real, never disappears. It just changes shape, from touch to memory, from presence to peace. Some evenings I still make jasmine tea. The ritual stays the same. Water just below boiling, 2 teaspoons of leaves, 3 minutes of waiting. The scent fills the room, and with it comes something softer than nostalgia. I sipped slowly, not searching for the past in the taste anymore, but finding comfort in the warmth itself. You would have liked that, the way life becomes ordinary again, and how beauty hides in those small, unremarkable moments. You used to say the simplest things were always the truest. The smell of rain, the sound of pages turning, the feel of someone breathing beside you in the dark. I didn't understand how someone could live so gently in a world so sharp. But now I do. You taught me. Letting go wasn't a single goodbye. It was a series of small yeses. Yes to waking alone, but not lonely. Yes to hearing your name and smiling instead of aching. Yes to walking past the bridge and noticing, not remembering. Each yes was a quiet liberation. I still think of you sometimes, but not in the way I once did. It's like remembering a song I loved long ago, one whose melody I still hum when it rains, not out of sorrow, but gratitude. You were a chapter I no longer need to reread to know by heart. The rain that evening was thin and silver, threading through the light of the lanterns. I stood at my window and watched it fall, realizing that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for it to stop. I had become part of it, calm, steady, flowing. Letting go, I realized, doesn't mean closing the door. It means leaving it open, trusting that whatever once lived inside you can step into the world and still be whole. You can love and lose and still be tender. You can remember without returning. The last time I crossed the bridge, I didn't stop. The rain fell softly on my shoulders. The stones glistened beneath my shoes, and for once, I didn't look back. Not because I'd forgotten, but because I finally understood. Love doesn't end where people part. It continues quietly, in kindness, in gentleness, in every heartbeat that keeps choosing peace. That night, as the rain eased into a hush, I found myself walking home more slowly than usual. The streets glowed faintly beneath the lamplight, every puddle holding a fragment of the world, trembling softly when the wind passed through. It felt as if the city was breathing again after a long cry. I matched my steps to that rhythm, not rushing, not resisting, just moving gently through the damp air dot. There was peace in noticing things I used to overlook. The sound of water dripping from the eaves, the faint scent of wet bread from a nearby bakery closing for the night, the low hum of a radio somewhere behind fogged glass. Life was still happening all around me, quietly and tenderly. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't trapped in memory. I was part of the evening itself. The sky was a soft gray blue, brushed with the faintest light from distant windows. My reflection followed me on the wet pavement, familiar yet changed. I smiled at it, this quieter version of myself who no longer needed to carry everything. Healing, I realized, isn't something that happens suddenly. It grows slowly, like moss on stone, until one day you notice the cracks have turned green again. When I reached the small alley that led to my street, the rain picked up again, but only slightly, enough to make the air shimmer. I passed the old bookstore with its flickering sign, the one we used to visit on long afternoons. It was closed now, but I could still see the outline of the shelves through the glass. I remembered how you'd wander through the aisles, tracing the spines of books like they were people you'd once known. You always said you liked old bookstores because every story here has already survived something. I thought of that often. How love, too, survives in fragments dot further down. A neighbor was bringing in laundry she'd forgotten to take down before the rain. The wet clothes clung to her arms, and she laughed softly to herself. The sound carried through the air like a small, joyful secret. I smiled without meaning to. There was something beautiful about the ordinariness of it, the way life insists on going on. Even through drizzle dot, by the time I reached my building, the streets had emptied. I climbed the stairs slowly, feeling the wood creak beneath my feet. Inside, the apartment smelled of tea and rain-soaked wool. I hung my coat by the window and watched the droplets roll down the glass, merging and separating like tiny lives, meeting and parting dot in the distance. Thunder murmured one last time, not sharp, but low and fading, like a memory settling into its final place. I stood there in the half-light, letting that sound fill the silence. It didn't hurt anymore. The ache that had once echoed through every quiet room had softened into something almost sweet. On the table sat my journal, the one I had started the year I met you. Its pages had yellowed a little, the edges curled, but it still felt alive, full of moments, words, pauses that once belonged to us. I picked it up and flipped through until I found a blank page. For the first time in years, I didn't write about loss. I wrote about the walk home, about puddles glowing under lamps, about laughter behind windows, about rain that felt less like grief and more like grace. When I finished, I left the journal open beside the cup of tea I'd made. Steam curled upward, soft and fleeting. Outside, the drizzle had become a whisper, just enough to lull the city toward sleep. I turned off the lamp and stood by the window a little longer, the darkness pressing gently against the glass. Somewhere out there, I thought, you might be walking too, under a different rain, in a different city, and maybe you'd feel it too. The peace that comes not from forgetting, but from forgiving everything. Even the weather. The night wrapped itself around me like a blanket, warm despite the chill. And in that stillness, I realized I wasn't walking away from you anymore. I was simply walking toward myself. The rain finally stopped some time before dawn. I woke to the sound of silence, the kind that feels full rather than empty. The air was cool, carrying the scent of wet earth and tea leaves. Outside the window, the sky was a pale wash of gray, still holding the softness of night. For a moment, I lay there listening to the faint dripping from the eaves, each sound falling like a memory that had learned how to rest. I rose slowly, wrapped myself in a sweater, and walked to the kitchen. The floor was cold beneath my feet, grounding. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, watching the thin curl of steam rise as it began to hum. Everything felt unhurried. Even time seemed content to linger for a while. I made jasmine tea, the way I always did. 2 spoonfuls, 3 minutes, a touch of honey. As the scent filled the room, I felt something settle inside me, a calm that had taken years to find. The first sip was warm, faintly sweet, and when I closed my eyes, I realized the taste no longer reminded me of you. It reminded me of peace. The small wooden table by the window was still scattered with familiar things. A book left open from the night before. The journal with its ink still drying. A single candle melted halfway down. Light spilled softly through the glass, illuminating the tiny particles of dust floating like quiet stars. I sat there and watched the world wake dot outside. The street shimmered under a thin veil of mist. The puddles were fading, the cobblestones glistening faintly where the sunlight tried to push through. A sparrow hopped along the railing, shaking droplets from its feathers. Somewhere, a vendor began setting up her cart, the soft clatter of metal echoing down the lane. It was all so ordinary, and that ordinariness was beautiful. I cupped my hands around the tea and exhaled. The steam touched my face like breath, and for a fleeting moment, I thought of the night we said goodbye, how your hands had trembled just slightly when you passed me the umbrella, how the light had caught in your eyes before you turned away. The memory no longer hurt. It had become a soft ache, the kind that doesn't demand attention but lives quietly, like background music in a familiar cafe. I smiled to myself. You had been a chapter, not a cage. A lesson in tenderness, not loss. The bridge, the rain, the letters, they were all part of a story that had taught me how to love gently, how to let go without bitterness. And here I was, in the quiet morning that followed, living proof that hearts do mend, not by forgetting, but by learning to hold both joy and sorrow in the same palm. A beam of light finally broke through the clouds, landing right on the table where my tea sat steaming. It turned the pale liquid gold. I watched the steam twist upward, and in that dance, I saw something wordless, a kind of grace that comes only after the storm. I took out my pen and wrote a single line in my journal. Some loves don't return, but their kindness stays. Then I closed the book. That felt like enough. The world outside grew brighter, the mist dissolving, the sound of morning slowly taking shape. Footsteps, bicycle wheels, a child laughing somewhere down the street. The city was alive again, and so was I. I stood, stretched, and walked to the window. The bridge was faintly visible in the distance, its curve catching the new light. For the first time, it looked ordinary again. Not a place of endings, but just part of the city's rhythm. People would cross it today without knowing the stories it held. And somehow, that comforted me. The bridge had done its work. It had carried what it needed to. And so had I. I took one last sip of tea, the warmth blooming through me like quiet sunlight. The rain had left everything shining, the pavement, the leaves, even the sky. And standing there, in the stillness of a morning that belonged only to itself, I felt the simplest truth settle deep within me. Peace doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, like light through clouds, until one day you realize it has filled the whole room. By the time morning fully arrived, the bridge stood gleaming under a pale blue sky. The rain had washed everything clean, the stones, the railings, even the air itself. It looked smaller now, humbler, as though the weight of memory had finally lifted. I walked there again that day, not out of habit or nostalgia, but out of quiet gratitude. The streets leading to it were slick with light. Water still dripped from the branches above, landing softly on my shoulders as I passed beneath. The city moved gently around me, footsteps on wet pavement, distant laughter, a motorbike humming somewhere down the road. There was no melancholy in it, only the simple music of life continuing. When I reached the bridge, the river below shimmered like glass. The reflection of the sky lay perfectly still, broken only when the wind brushed its surface. The lanterns, now unlit, hung quiet and unassuming, their glass panes catching traces of sunlight. I ran my hand along the railing, feeling the cool metal beneath my fingertips. It was strange. The same place that had once carried so much weight now felt impossibly light. A young couple was standing where we once did, sharing coffee from a paper cup, their laughter spilling freely into the morning. They didn't notice me, and I didn't want them to. There was something comforting about watching new stories bloom where old ones had ended. The bridge had never belonged to us alone. It belonged to the endless flow of people who crossed it, carrying their own beginnings, their own goodbyes. I leaned on the railing and closed my eyes. The sunlight on my face felt warm, unburdened. I thought of all the times I had stood here searching for meaning, waiting for peace to arrive from somewhere outside myself. And yet, here it was, quiet, steady, breathing in rhythm with the river. Peace had been waiting all along, not on the bridge, not in memory, but in the simple act of accepting that some stories finish beautifully by ending. A breeze rose from the water, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked earth. It lifted the hem of my coat, brushed against my cheek, and for a moment I felt something like a touch, light, familiar, gone before I could name it. I didn't chase it. Some presences aren't meant to stay. They just pass through to remind you that you are still capable of feeling. I whispered a soft thank you, not to you, not to the past, but to the bridge itself, to the rain that had once hidden our tears, to the silence that had kept our words safe, to the years that had turned pain into gentleness. Every goodbye, I realized, is also a beginning in disguise. The couple beside me started to leave. Their footsteps echoed briefly before fading into the hum of the city. I stayed a little longer, tracing the slow ripple of the river. The water moved without hurry, without memory, just presence. Watching it, I understood what you meant long ago when you said rain never falls on the same world twice. Everything had changed, including me. Especially me. I smiled then, quietly, the way people do when they finally understand something they've been carrying for too long. Love hadn't vanished. It had simply changed shape. It had become this: sunlight on wet stone, the smell of new rain, the calm of knowing that nothing was wasted, not even sorrow. I took one last look at the bridge before turning away. Behind me, the city stretched open, washed clean, waiting. My footsteps sounded soft against the stone, each one lighter than the last dot. As I reached the end of the bridge, I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the water shimmer in the light. It no longer looked like a grave of old memories, but like a mirror for everything that still awaited me. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't whisper goodbye. I whispered thank you. The wind carried it away, dissolving into the bright morning like a prayer too small for words. Evening found me again by the window, where everything had begun. The rain had not returned yet, but the sky was heavy with it, the kind of weight that promised tenderness rather than storm. The city below moved softly, lights flickering in the distance, 1,000 quiet lives unfolding at once. I sat there, with my cup of tea still warm, watching the world slip into blue. The bridge was barely visible now, just a faint outline against the horizon. Yet even in shadow, it felt alive, steady, unchanging, patient. I thought of how many goodbyes it must have held, how many beginnings it had silently witnessed. And for the first time, I realized every person who crosses it leaves something behind and takes something new with them. That's what bridges do. They hold the middle, not belonging to either side, but carrying everything between. That was what we had been, too. A bridge between who I was before you and who I became after. We met somewhere in the middle, not to last, but to change each other gently. And now, years later, I could finally see that it had been enough. The rain began again, softly, almost shyly, tapping against the glass like an old friend knocking at the door. I smiled and let it in. The sound filled the room, steady and familiar, and I felt my breath fall into its rhythm. I didn't think of you as absence anymore. You were part of this, the rain, the light, the quiet that no longer hurt. I opened my journal one last time. The pages smelled faintly of paper and weather, a comforting mix of past and present. I wrote without hesitation. Love is not meant to stay. It's meant to pass through, to teach us how to see beauty, how to hold softness, how to let go without closing our hands. When I finished, I left the journal open. There was no need to close it. The story didn't need to end. It simply needed to rest. Outside, the rain thickened, blurring the lights into small golden halos. It reminded me of that first night under the umbrella. Two strangers sharing shelter, not knowing they were building a memory that would one day become a home inside someone's heart. How fragile and beautiful that was, to exist in someone else's remembering. I leaned closer to the window, tracing a circle on the fogged glass. My reflection looked calm, older, but kind. The kind of person who had made peace with the rain. I thought of everything we'd left unsaid, and how none of it felt unfinished anymore. The rain had spoken for us all these years. It had carried our silence across time, washing it clean until only gentleness remained. In the soft glow of the lamp, I whispered the words I never managed to say when you were here. I loved you quietly. I still do, but differently now. The words hung in the air, warm and weightless. They didn't ache. They soothed. Outside, the rain answered in its endless language, steady, kind, infinite. I sat there until the tea cooled, until the room filled with the scent of earth and night. And somewhere between one breath and the next, I realized I was no longer waiting. Not for you, not for closure, not for anything to begin again. I was simply present, alive within the sound of falling raindrop. The clock ticked softly. A small draft lifted the curtain, and for an instant, I could have sworn I heard laughter. Distant, familiar, fading into the hum of the rain. I didn't turn to look. Some echoes are meant to remain behind you, guiding rather than haunting. Dot. As the night deepened, the bridge disappeared completely into mist. But I could still feel it, its quiet strength, its patient grace. And I knew that somewhere out there, the rain was falling on both sides of it, connecting what was and what would be. I lifted my cup, took one last sip, and let the warmth settle in my chest. There, in the dim light and the soft music of rain, I finally understood what love had been trying to tell me all along. Some goodbyes are just another way of saying thank you. And when the rain stopped, the silence it left behind was not empty. It was peace.